The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individuals participating in the show. All persons described or mentioned in the podcast should be considered innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. This podcast contains subject matter such as violence and graphic descriptions along with adult language, which may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
On February 17th, 1997, one of the heirs to $1 million candy fortune goes missing after boarding a flight to, some fucking where. She was going from the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota to return to her mansion in Glenview, Illinois, and she disappeared. I don't know. He'll tell you the rest. You're listening to the Mysterious Brews podcast. And tonight we're bringing the case of Helen Brach.
65-year-old Helen Brach was known as the Candy Lady after inheriting her late husband's Brach Candy Company fortune. She was also a horse lover, and that made her a prime target for Richard Bailey, career conman who stalked well-heeled widows.
I have prosecuted hundreds of people who have committed thousands of evil deeds, but only probably...
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to part 2 of the Helen Brach story. When we last left you...
And we're back!
When we left you last week, we would...
No, hey, we got a banter, bro. What are you talking about?
We just bantered for 30 minutes.
People off that won't banter at the end.
Speaking of which, you're right. All right. So, speaking of which, outpouring of support for the bullshit at the beginning. So, guess what? We ain't changing.
We ain't changed. We changed for you. We ain't changing for you.
All right. So since
back on our bullshit.
That's right. Since our last episode, we do have a new patron at the $3 tier.
Oh shit! Throw it on the pile that you have.
Lauren Holmes. Well, we lose them about as fast as we get them. So.
Oh. See, you never mentioned that. So if you just listen to the podcast, you think we got 1 million Patreons.
Yeah,
you
would
ever talk about when we lose one.
No, they ain't getting any free advertisement. But I'll give you a no, I apologize. This may be one of the few that we have in the great state of Kansas. Kansas. So welcome to the shit show, Miss Holmes. All right. I don't have any other. I sat through one. All right. So you'll appreciate this. We have to do these PLCs, professional learning, whatever the hell they want to call it. Community, what? I don't. Potato, I don't care.
Basically, you have to sit through an email.
Yes, but.
You have to sit through an hour-long email.
This is a 1, 2, 3, 5. This is a 5 or 6 part email. And to make matters worse, it's the entire grade band, which means the entire middle school, because I shifted down a grade band. While this would appeal to 75% of the population, we are being taught how to incorporate gifted teaching into our classrooms. Now, educators will be like, well, you can use some of that stuff. Yeah, you're right. You can use some of it. But 95%
90% of that shit don't pertain to you.
No, it does not. I'm doing good.
The job I got, like the job I have doing the severely special ed, none of it pertains to me.
No, and you still have to sit through it.
But I still have to sit through that bullshit. It ain't fair.
No, it ain't fair. And here's what kills me. When you bring up the fact, like they're like playing these, how would you implement this? And then you get called on it because you have rest and fuck off face. And you're like, how am I going to implement it? Hell, lady, I'm doing good to keep them engaged for 50 minutes as it is. Now,
Could I use a piece of this? Yeah, I could, but I've seen this story before. It's called backwards design. That shit didn't work 15 years ago, and just like that, it's going to go away.
Everything in education
is cyclical.
And it's like every 2 or 3 years, something new and improved comes along, and you have to change everything about the way you teach to follow along with what your school board was like. This is the best practice we could ever hope for. And then 2 years, it takes them 2 years to realize it don't fucking work.
And then they shit can it. Yep. Here's the thing that I don't understand about the whole crap about the cyclical stuff. And if you're a teacher in the South, you'll know what the hell I'm talking about. If it's ever been tried in New York, Michigan, or the upper Northeast, or the great state of California, about 8 years after they've shit canned it and have all the data in the world that proves that it's worthless, we will just, hey, give it the old college try.
Yep, that is 100% true.
So enough of that bullshit. You got anything you want to talk about?
Actually, no, I'm good. We can go ahead and get started and make these fuckers that don't like our banter happy.
Yeah, we cut it down to 4 minutes this time.
Oh, shit.
Yeah. So let's do this. We're going to kick the tires and light the fires, ladies and gents. Oh, you will be, before we do this, you will be impressed. I have taught my kids how to solve equations with just variables out of that movie, What Don't You Want? And ain't none of them picked up on it. I was like, what don't we want right here? And so they're like, we don't want, and then they'll name it. I'm like, so what don't you want? And so my co-teacher's over there in tears because he's seen the movie. I looked at him today after I worked one, and I said, hey, we don't serve any trout.
You played that clip on the last episode, but you didn't play the whole clip.
Well, goddamn.
So now people, what I'm saying is like, either you don't want the green beans or you don't want the corn on the cob. So what don't you want? You say, well, I don't want green beans. I don't want green beans either. So, okay, two T-bone steaks, medium rare. He's like, I would like that wasn't a question.
No, that wasn't a damn question. So here you go for everybody out there.
What don't you want?
Pardon?
What don't you want?
Oh, well, I think I just...
I've been working here for 44 years. Ain't nobody ever ordered nothing but T-bone steak and a baked potato. Except this one asshole from New York tried to order trout back in 1987. We don't sell no goddamn trout. T-bone steaks. So either you don't want the corn on the cob, or you don't want the green beans. So what don't you want?
And there you go.
No, keep playing it.
That's it. I can't go on any further. Hell, it'd be 4 minutes long.
Well, it just says, well, I don't want green beans. I don't want green beans either.
And then he's like, and then she goes, 2 T-bone steaks, medium. And he goes, I'll take mine. That wasn't a damn question.
Yeah, and the funniest part is when she's done, they look at each other and go, ain't nobody going to rob this place.
Yeah, because they're trying to watch the bank across the street. All right, so like I said about an hour ago, when we last left you, we discussed how Helen Brach vanished without a trace in early 1977, the year of our Lord. We talked about how her houseman, Jack Matlick, basically lied about the whole weekend in question, and we had closed with how her young boyfriend, Richard Bailey, was not off the radar of the Popo. So Helen had recently begun to suspect he had conned her in a few of her horse deals. And she may have been considering going to the authorities about it, but before she could do that, she disappeared. After her disappearance, Richard Bailey was contacted about this and asked what he knew. He stated that he didn't know much more than anyone else. He was in Florida on that weekend that Helen was last seen. He was expecting her to arrive on Saturday. When she didn't show up, he called the house in Chicago on Sunday. Jack would tell him she wasn't there and that she was out to dinner. Richard stated that he called a couple more times with no response, so he assumed Helen had decided not to call him, and he went about his business in Florida. Richard also denied ever swindling Helen. He said he introduced her to sellers and trainers, but he never knew she was getting a bad deal. He denied that she got a bad deal, and he said he was clueless that she was talking about going to the authorities about anything. They had been... Wait a minute. What? Oh, they had talked several times leading up to her disappearance, and she hadn't said anything to him about being upset or thinking that she wasn't getting a good deal. Richard had a solid alibi in Florida that weekend. Now, that doesn't rule out contract killing, and we'll get into that a little bit later, even though that does sound extremely absurd on the surface. But we are talking about the criminal underworld of horse thievery. So investigators could not draw a straight line between Richard and Helen Brach's disappearance, to give you the Reader's Digest version there. So the case had a small break of sorts in 1978, just a little more than a year after Helen went missing. The body of an elderly woman was found in Wentworth Woods. You may ask yourself, where would Wentworth Woods be? Well, it is a suburb of the city called Calumet City, which is just outside of Chicago, where she lived. Now, initially, investigators thought this was Helen, largely due to the unknown body, having red and gray hair, just like Helen did. The state of the remains looked like they had been there for at least a year, and the body was missing its fingertips and several teeth. So identifying it was going to be difficult. After the medical examiner finished his examination, he concluded that the body was not Helen Brach. The woman was a few inches shorter than Helen, and it appeared that some of the missing teeth were due to two missing partial dentures. Helen did not have any dentures, so the body was ultimately buried in a pauper's grave with little to no attempt to identify her. Now, around this time, a very boring civil proceeding was taking place. And basically, this is not anything out of the ordinary, because when someone goes missing, somebody's got to pay the mortgage, somebody's got to control the bank accounts, manage business accounts, investments, etc. Now, imagine all of that on a multimillionaire scale that is tied to one of the largest candy companies in America. So with no spouse, parents, or adult children to take over this state, it was in shambles. Frank Brach, her former husband, did have children from his first marriage, but they were grown, so when he married Helen, it was not set up that they would take control of the state in Helen's absence. There were proceedings to figure out what to do next, and that sparked a small investigation. So in January of 1978, 11 months after Helen was last seen, Jack Matlick sat down for an on-the-record deposition with various attorneys of the various parties that had some interest in the estate. His own attorney would not let him answer any questions directly related to Helen's disappearance. Now, we don't get a retelling of his wild and weird story about the weekend that he and only he saw Helen. What we do get and what we do learn is that Jack had stayed on as a caretaker of the property until December of 1977, when he was fired by the person managing the finances at the time. Now, this meant that on top of the 2 to 3 weeks Jack was alone in the house before he reported Helen missing, he was there for an additional 9 months. This is a little odd considering he is one of the main persons of interest, if not a full-blown suspect. He had full access to what could have been the scene of the crime. Adding to the list of things that his attorney would not let him speak on is the whole thing about the checks that he cashed. So Jack claimed in this deposition that he saw a copy of Helen's will in the house around the middle of 1976. He said he didn't know any or everything that was in it, but that Helen said she intended to make her brother a millionaire. However, she didn't want her brother's wife to have access to any of that money, so Helen planned to put it in a trust in only Charles's name. So the rest of the fortune was going to go to various animal charities. Jack also claimed he dug the copy of the will out of a drawer and tried to give it to the police after Helen disappeared. The police said, bullshit, this never happened. They actually had wanted to see the will themselves and were not able to because the lawyer refused to let them look for it. Add this to the list of weird shit that Jack has said, because it would be highly unusual for the police in an investigation of a millionaireess to not remember that the houseman, aka Jack, tried to give them a copy of the will that they were looking to peruse. Now, Jack said that as far as he knew, the copy of the will still sat in a drawer in the house, probably in a nightstand where he last saw it. Remember, the house had been thoroughly searched from top to bottom by the police, and then again by a private investigator. The PI specifically was looking for financial and legal papers. You know, kind of like a copy of a will, and he didn't find one. So Jack was then asked if he had gotten rid of or destroyed any of Helen's records, and Jack very carefully said no records were destroyed. Now, the lawyer performing the deposition picked up on the fact that Jack specified records rather than just a blanket, no, I did not destroy anything. So, old super duper lawyer follows up by asking Jack if he destroyed any papers at all. Jack admitted to burning 2 old diaries and the automatic writings. And if you've forgotten what automatic writings are, that's where Helen claimed that spirits would contact her and she would just take pen to paper and they would guide her and let her write.
What do you think about that? You think that's true? You think people can do that?
I don't know. Now that the one thing I will say about all of that, I don't know about automatic writings, but where they put the headphones on and they're listening to that static of the radio and someone is asking questions that they can't hear and they're supposed to call out words.
Yeah.
Kind of like in Hellier. That's some freaky shit.
That's some creepy shit, man. But like, you know, Houdini, not what you're talking about, but Houdini spent most of his later years trying to disprove people talking to the dead, to the point where he wanted to have a seance every year on his, like, either his birthday or Christmas or the date of his death or whatever. They did it for like 10 years with, and he had a secret code word he gave his wife before he died. And said, if they actually contact him, he will say that word. And he never did.
Wonder why.
I don't know, man. Maybe because they just couldn't. They just didn't do it right.
Maybe because he swallowed a bunch of water? Maybe so.
Maybe.
I mean, that's a good educated guess. So Jack reiterates the reason he... What? Jack reiterates the reason he did it was because Helen had instructed him to do it in case something happened to her. Now, people that have investigated this case on the interwebs theorize that Jack did this to slip something incriminating in with all of said stuff she was wanting destroyed. Like, maybe some evidence. The question I have is, let's say Jack did burn all the stuff to cover something up. Why did he purposely do it with an accomplice present? Because remember, the brother's there. He first asked the financial advisor, Everett Moore, about burning it. And Everett was like, hell no, we don't even know if she's missing. So when Everett turns him down, that's when he goes to Charles, the brother. And here's the thing. He doesn't take Charles straight to the police. When Charles arrives in town, he takes him to the mansion to burn said shit. So why did Jack want someone to see him burning these things? Why didn't he just go ahead and just destroy it privately? So there's 2 ways to think about this. One was that Jack also burned Helen's diaries, which were something that people knew she had. There is the possibility that there was something in there incriminating to him, and he knew people would be looking for them. So by getting permission from someone else to burn the diaries, he wouldn't look as guilty when someone asked where they were. Numero 2 is that Jack was actually being honest about this, and he destroyed them because Helen wanted him to. Now, I bring this up because the journal Helen was last seen with was not burned. This would have been the one you'd expect anything about the horse swindling, going to the authorities, any of that stuff to be written down in. This specific journal has never been found. Her brother Charles and the financial advisor Everett both confirmed that it was not in the pile of things Jack wanted to burn. Now, they knew which one it was based on the cover. Maybe Helen really did say, if anything happens to me, destroy these items, and Jack was just doing what she wished for. This does not make Jack look any less guilty. What?
I said that it's not suspicious at all, you know?
And that's what I was about to say. It doesn't make him look less guilty. It just... I don't know.
Maybe she's like, hey, I'm going to go on this trip real quick. Make sure you burn everything I ever own, every document in the house. I'm just going to go to the Mayo Clinic for a few days, though.
And that's the hang up, because how did he know something had happened to her before they reported her missing?
I don't know. Maybe because he made her missing?
Dun, 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 dun.
Dun, dun, dun.
If I was a betting man, I'd lay 3-1 odds on that one right there. So even people who were close to Helen didn't rush to the house when they heard she was missing because they assumed she was simply out of touch with them. Jack was the only one jumping to the conclusion that Helen would never be coming home. So Jack finished his deposition without really answering anything about Helen's disappearance, so we didn't get a whole lot out of that other than what we already knew and what we had already discussed in part 1. Now, shortly after his deposition, Jack moved to Pennsylvania. Again, a little odd. The next person deposed was one Charles Voorhees, Helen's brother, and we see in his deposition that Charles is just not a very curious person. He comes across very passive in a very odd manner to, considering that his sister was missing and millions of dollars were at stake, he was just kind of ho-hum about it. From his deposition, we kind of get the impression that he took Jack Matlick at face value and went along with burning Helen's things, not because Helen told him to, but because that's what Jack said she wanted. Jack first told him he was worried Helen had amnesia and was somewhere out there wandering around. A few weeks after that, he said he was worried she was dead. Charles didn't have a theory of his own. He didn't get emotional when asked about her disappearance, and he didn't speculate. He came across like he wasn't all that concerned with what was happening with the money. Charles knew Helen intended to leave him a sizable fortune, but he wasn't pushing to have her declared dead so that he could get it. He wasn't even all that worried about who was managing the estate or her fortune. Charles wasn't thrilled at being deposed either. He did seem nervous when he first sat down, but he was taking everything presented to him at face value and didn't seem that interested in what was going to happen. So the lawyers worked on getting another authorized search done of the house, which happened in April of 1978. This was done partially to look again for any papers indicating what steps to take next, and what they found was not just kind of weird, but extremely weird. In the kitchen, searchers almost immediately find in a drawer in an envelope with Helen's name on it a copy of her 5-page will.
Convenient.
Yes.
Don't you think?
Yes. Now, it was unsigned and undated, but it appeared that she had written 1974 in the margin. Now, later on in the search, in an upstairs room that Helen used pretty much as a giant closet, they find a suitcase standing upright in plain sight. Like it should have had a neon sign flashing above it. It was that wide open. There on the suitcase was the airline claim tag attached, indicating it was the suitcase she brought from Rochester, Minnesota, back to Chicago. Now, remember, from one little tidbit in part 1, we talked about how investigators could not find the suitcase. This was the whole basis as to why they didn't think Helen actually made it home. Now, here is said suitcase just sitting there. Inside were receipts from the Mayo Clinic and the hotel. How is this possible? We all have read about cases or watched documentaries where things are missed on searches. But like I said earlier, this house had been searched twice, and two key pieces of evidence that the police and the private investigators had specifically looked for were found almost immediately this time. And they were not just tucked away in some weird spot. This was clearly staged, and it begs the question as to why. Why not have these things found in an earlier search? Was there something in the will or in the suitcase someone didn't want the police to know about at first and then decided to plant them? These were not just props.
Or maybe they needed time to clean it out. You know what I'm saying? Or maybe they needed time to clear out whatever they didn't want them to find. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yes, but what I guess the argument against that would be, if that's the case, don't let it be found on the first search or the second search. Let the private investigators find it on their search, or don't let it be found on the first search by authorities and found on the second search by authorities.
Don't let it be found at all.
Well, that's true. Now, these were not just props left out so that the lawyers could find them. The will was a genuine copy of Helen's will, and the suitcase was the one she took to the Mayo Clinic. Whoever had them decided to either put them back in the house or move them from where they were being hidden. The suitcase being found didn't sway everyone that Helen had gotten on the flight in Minnesota. Now, Reddit is full of people who still believe someone else flew on Helen's ticket and checked the bag to sell the idea that she made it back to Chicago. If that was the goal all along, why not have the suitcase found on the first search or even the second, like I had said previously? Since it was supposedly part of convincing the police that Helen made it home, it doesn't make any sense. But again, there ain't a whole lot in this case that makes any sense.
I'm confused as all hell. I'll be honest with you.
Now,
everybody's just nonchalant about this. Like, oh, well, whatever. No police investigation. All these lies, and no one seems to give a shit.
No, they don't.
I mean, I'm not victim blaming at all. Don't get me wrong, but I'm saying, like, was she like a terrible person to these people, and just nobody cared?
Not from what I could gather. Like, she was well liked by her friends that she talked to on the phone all the time. She was well liked by all the animal charities because, she's giving them money. But also, going back to Jack and Everett, the financial advisor, they've never said anything bad about her. So it would lead you to believe that they had a pretty amicable relationship.
Right.
All right, so we're not done with all these depositions either. Now, the next person that was deposed was one Mr. Richard Bailey, and on the advice of his lawyer, he didn't just refuse to answer any questions about Helen's disappearance. He refused to answer any question point blank, period. And I'm not exaggerating, folks. He even refused to say his name. There was a whole kerfuffle about it, and his attorney finally said that they agreed to stipulate that he was the Richard Bailey in question. He never uttered those words. The lawyer said it. All he had to do was say his name, but instead he had his attorney talking about stipulating to the fact that he was Richard Bailey, and when they next asked his address, Richard took the fifth. Then he took the fifth on every question after that. This deposition was a master class in thumbing your nose at the man. Richard didn't say anything at the deposition because obviously he knew he was a person of interest, if not a suspect in the case. He and Jack Matlick were both under suspicion, and some people were not going to let Richard forget it. A year after the depositions, someone spray painted, quote, "Richard Bailey knows where Mrs. Bach's body is. Stop him, please," end quote. It was spray painted on the road near Helen's house. Now, Richard said he had similar messages graffitied at the stables he owned, but he never reported the vandalism to the police. He just painted over it. He said he just assumed that it was a competitor who was trying to drive business away from him and to them. At the end of the investigation that dealt with the civil case in 1980, it was recommended to the court that Helen Brach be declared dead. This would allow for everything to move forward in the probate court. The judge says, "Nope, ain't happening, Captain." She was still a missing person, and he was going to have them wait the full 7 years. So that's what Helen's brother Charles did. He waited until 1984, and he had Helen declared legally dead. Her attorney finally produced the will, which was identical to the one found in the kitchen, except this one was signed. So Charles wanted the court to put Helen's date of death as February 17th, 1977. That is the day she was last seen by someone who was not Jack Matlick. By this point, Charles had made no secret of the fact that he thought Jack was responsible for what happened to his sister, or he at least knew what happened to her. Charles also had another motive for having it set back to 1977. If Helen had been dead for 7 years, the estate would have to pay interest on the inheritance that they hadn't paid him. The inheritance was $500,000 in trust funds in 1977. And that's 7 years of interest on $500,000, which makes a big old chunk of change. Now, Helen's financial planner, Everett Moore, was managing the estate, and he asked the date of the death to be established as February 21st, 1984. 7 years to the day Jack dropped her off, Helen, at the airport. Allegedly dropped her off. Now, that would take away the interest owed to Charles, but it would also validate Jack's statement that he saw her the entire weekend. The judge had the ultimate say when it came to the date and ultimately sided with Charles, setting the date of death as February 17th, 1977. He said there was no proof that Helen made it home or was alive after she left the Mayo Clinic. Now, this is very interesting if you think about it. You have a judge whose sole job was to determine when Helen Brach died. He looked at all the evidence put forth before him and did not believe there was enough evidence to say that Jack was telling the truth. So with Helen declared dead, it was time to settle the estate. Just like everything else in this case, it didn't go too smoothly. Jack had...
I never would have guessed that.
I know. It would have been a curveball if it had. Jack had actually been left $50,000, but the estate took his ass to court over the checks from 1977 that he cashed. Remember that everyone who looked at them believed they were forged. The court accused Jack of stealing money and valuables over the 9 months he was in the house after Helen disappeared. They were suing for a value around $90,000, with about $75,000 of that being cash. Jack was initially going to fight this, but the two sides reached an out-of-court settlement. In said settlement, it was proposed that if Jack just shut the hell up and walked away from his claim to the $50,000, they would drop their suit, asking for $75,000 in cash. Now, accepting this deal was not necessarily an admission of guilt. Lawsuits are extremely time-consuming and expensive, and Jack must have been cutting his losses, to be honest with you. Helen's brother Charles was paid his trust fund. The usual administrative costs were paid, and the bulk of Helen Brach's estate would wind up going to animal welfare charities. So I tell you the boring shit about the estate to bring to light that we glean all of the information about what Jack owed to the estate and what the estate owed him, because of that information was given to the court from just one source. And that one source was Jack's ex-wife, Joyce, who he was married to at the time Helen disappeared. Joyce would testify that Jack would stay at the Glenview mansion when Helen wasn't in town to do, quote, upkeep, which is basically house sitting, but he rarely stayed there overnight when Helen was home. Jack was at the mansion when Helen went to the Mayo Clinic with plans to go home after Helen came back on Thursday, February 17th. Jack had told the police that he called Joyce at 5:30 p.m. to tell her that Helen was back, but he was still going to stay at the house to help her pack. Joyce said that didn't happen at all. When Jack called, he said he wouldn't be home that night because Helen didn't come home as planned. Jack said he would be staying at her place until she did arrive home. Now, according to Joyce, Jack ended up coming home on Sunday, February the 20th, and said Helen had only just made it back into town that day, and she was leaving again the next day for Florida. He spent that night at his home. This contradicts what he told the police about how he stayed at Helen's the entire weekend and drove her to the airport early Monday morning. Joyce did say that Jack got up very early on Monday and left the house. The point of Joyce's testimony in the court case was the money the estate claimed Jack stole. So Joyce said that before Helen's disappearance, she would write checks when she would go grocery shopping. Nothing out of the ordinary. But after Helen disappeared, Jack always gave her cash for groceries, and said cash was always in large denominations, like $100 bill, y'all. Jack never explained where the money was coming from, and Joyce didn't ask. Her and Jack were on the verge of divorce about this time, and she didn't really give a shit what was happening in his life. She was just glad he was living at Helen's and not in her home. So if Joyce's story is accurate, it leads you to believe that Helen, in fact, did not make it home after the Mayo Clinic. Maybe Jack didn't know what was going on at first, and that's why he told his wife he was waiting for her to get back. But then he was pulled into a cover-up over the weekend, either through bribery or fear. I'm thinking fear.
Fear's a hell of a motivator.
Yeah, because even back then, $50,000, it's not a whole lot of money.
It's not enough to where you're going to be set for life, that's for sure. You're still going to end up having to work at some point.
Right. So we fast forward to the late 1980s, and we have some major developments in the case. We have some major developments in the case. Enter in one Maurice Ferguson.
Ooh.
Yeah, Maurice had a cellmate. And that cellmate was none other than Silas Jane back in the 70s. You know, Silas was the horse guy who went to jail for conspiracy to murder his brother. See, Silas and Richard Bailey were connected through their Chicago area horse scams. When Silas was paroled in 1979, according to Maurice, he left prison promising Maurice a job when he got out. So, later on in 1979, when Maurice was released, he went and found Silas to ask about said promised job. The job Silas had for him was to move the remains of a woman from where they were hidden at a stable and then rebury them somewhere else. Maurice allegedly moved said body. He stated that he didn't know who the woman was. All he would say was that Silas allegedly called her the, quote, candy lady. Maurice managed to stay out of prison for a whole 27 days before he was pinched again. Charges from Mississippi were levied, and the police made note of his connection to the infamous Silas Jane. At the time they interviewed him, Maurice told the story about moving the body, and twice he led investigators to places in Illinois as the burial spot, and both times they didn't find squaddly doddly. So
Squaddly doddly?
Yeah, that's a whole lot of nutting. That's a whole lot of nutting.
Is that an official term?
Oh, it's Webster's official, buddy. So now we jump to 1987, and Maurice comes forward again saying, you know what? I'm ready to let you know where the real location of the body is on at least a very good approximation. Maurice said he buried the remains in the Twin Cities area of Minnesota. It was a field either in or near a cemetery, and if they could figure out which cemetery, Maurice knew exactly where the spot was. The problem was he couldn't remember the name of the cemetery. So after 2 fake leads, why were authorities believing what he was saying? According to Maurice, it was because of one major change in circumstances, and by that he meant that old Silas was tits up. Silas had died in Silas had died in July of 1987, and Maurice claimed he was way too scared of Silas to give the real location of Helen's remains. But now that Silas was dead, he was ready to make things right. Maurice must have been really convincing because authorities bought his story hook, line, and sinker. So much so that Maurice was given a pass to leave the Mississippi prison system, where he was serving time for armed robbery, and was flown under guard to Minnesota. There, police would drive him around to cemeteries, none of which he recognized. Eventually, the authorities concluded that old Maurice got a nice vacation from his 35-year prison sentence on their dime.
I mean, and why not? What are they going to do?
Tell him not to do it again?
Is it illegal to confess to crimes that you didn't commit?
I don't think it is.
I'm being serious. I don't know.
I'm sure they'll add some time.
I don't. For what? What's the charge?
Lying to a court? I don't know. I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. If I was, we wouldn't be doing this podcast. So the idea of Silas James being involved did not come from Maurice. The authorities were already looking into him, and that is why they interviewed him to begin with. Silas was in prison at the time Helen disappeared and was actually in prison at the time she bought the horses from Richard. He had a solid alibi for all the crimes against Helen. The problem is that the horse scheming was not happening in isolated incidences. It was actually part of a larger organized crime ring. If Helen went to the authorities about getting cheated by Richard Bailey and or the people working with him, it could easily trigger an investigation that would lead back to the one and only Silas Jane. Now, Silas had been sentenced to 20 years with the eligibility of parole after 6 years. That's roughly about 1978, when he would have been up for parole. If he was implicated in said horse schemes that Helen was threatening to go to the police over, he would not have had a shot at parole. The investigation into the claims would have to run their course. If Silas was found to be innocent of the claims, it would be a minimum of at least a year he would have to wait for the investigation to run its course. If he was found to be culpable in some of the horse schemes, if not all of them, it would mean that he would have to stay in prison for decades.
Horse schemes is a very hilarious term. Horse schemes.
I couldn't come up with a better one.
Oh, I wasn't making fun of you or nothing. I'm just saying.
I beg to differ, sir. I believe we started the game we didn't get to finish. So this was quite the convenience that Helen Brach just disappeared and no complaint was filed, and old Silas was paroled 2 years later. Again, this is all alleged. Ain't none of this shit provable. If we chase this rabbit and believe that Helen was killed because of the horse scheme, and it was a hit ordered by the mastermind Silas Jane and not Richard Bailey, it passes the eye candy test. Of the two, Silas had a history of being involved in murder plots where Richard did not. Helen's disappearance is the only possible murder linked to Richard Bailey that I could find. Now, looking into Silas's background, we find that he has 5 or 6 murders linked to him. This includes the conviction Silas had from having his own brother killed. And not only did he have him offed, O-F-T.
O-F-T, offed.
He had him murdered in front of his brother's family on his nephew's birthday.
Sheesh.
You talk about a scorned man. Not only are you killing your brother, you're killing your brother in front of his family and his son. Why?
My son's part of the family.
Why, may you ask? Well, not on his body. I mean, this, from what I could gather, this kid was like 7 or 8.
But he's part of the family.
I'm going to slap shit out you.
I wish you'd try.
It'd be a long distance slap.
I wish you'd try, motherfucker. I wish you'd try.
Oh, why would you say that he killed his brother in front of his family, as Coach is so well documented now? Well, that's because, according to Silas, the old brother schemed him in a business deal, and he would not divulge said business deal because it would incriminate him further. So Richard Bailey was a con man, and when his scheme started closing in on him in the late 80s and early 90s, he didn't kill anybody. He just went to prison. In the late 1980s, a woman went to the police to file a complaint saying that Richard had scammed her in essentially the same way he allegedly conned old Helen Brach. When the police looked into it, they realized that while Richard had no criminal charges in his past related to this there were a lot of civil cases where people sued him to get their money back. In 1989, investigators approached the U.S. Attorney's Office. They stated that they believed that this was not just a civil matter, but it was more likely racketeering. The scams include phone calls that cross state lines. By crossing state lines, it made it a federal wire fraud case. This would give the federal government jurisdiction. So, an assistant U.S. attorney named Stephen Miller spoke with investigators. When investigators tell Mr. Miller that Richard Bailey was also a suspect/person of interest in the Helen Brach disappearance, old Mr. Miller decides he's going to investigate Helen's case alongside said fraud case. So he had come up with a very basic approach to solving homicides. And it's a good one. It's very sound. You follow the money, and it leaves you to the murderer.
Tends to happen that way.
Yeah. So this investigation took 5 years. The first step was to exhume that Jane Doe found in the woods back in 1978 and confirm that she really was not Helen Brach. In 1990, they identified where she was in the pauper's grave and brought her to the medical examiner's office. That is where they found that there was something missing. And that missing thing was the lady's head. The medical examiner looked through the records from 12 years prior to find out what the actual hell was going on. Had they sent off the head to an external lab for some better analysis? Possibly, but there was no record of it. Without the head, it seemed very suspicious, like someone purposely got rid of it to prevent anyone from identifying the lady. The medical examiner basically comes to the same conclusion in 1990 that they came to in 1978. It's not Helen Brach. But this still begs the question to A, who is this woman? And B, where the hell is her head at? So Mr. Miller also sends word to other law enforcement agencies that if they ended up with a case that had any shady horse business going on, they needed to let him know.
I don't know. I'm just cracking up, man. Horse business. Your horse and that. Just your horses, man. You're cracking me up.
It's a nag, man. It's a nag. He knew this horse scheme stretched beyond the Chicago area, and he was right. A tip came in that led investigators to look at a man named Tom Burns, who was arrested in Florida in 1991. He was part of a different type of horse fraud schemage. This schemage happened to be of the insurance variety. People would hire old Tom to kill their horses in a way that it would look like it was natural causes so that they could collect the insurance money. When he was arrested...
That's a horrible thing to do, man.
Yes, it's awful, man.
Imagine that's your profession, is I stage horse suicides or whatever.
He's the Dr. Kevorkian of the horse business.
Yeah. That is awful.
Now, when he was arrested, old Mr. Burns realizes that all of his rich-ass clients left his ass out to dry. So he was like, no, motherfucker. I am not going down for this on my own. And he turns state's evidence and starts telling it all, brother, telling it all.
Oh, I would have too.
He sold 36 people down the river who ultimately were arrested for their roles in the insurance fraud. 35 of said 36 were convicted. In exchange for his cooperation, old Mr. Burns finds out that he didn't know anything. I'm sorry. He only spent a year in jail. So when the AUSA, that would be the assistant U.S. attorney, Mr. Miller flies
down. I know that from watching Justified. When
Mr. Miller flies down to Florida to speak with Mr. Burns, he finds out that he didn't know anything about one Miss Helen Brach. Now, Tom would give more names of more people involved in the dark side of the horse business. This list of names leads Mr. Miller to a large animal vet who played a small role in the scams, but it was not big enough of a role to have some information that he was willing to share to save his ass from some jail time. He made it real clear that Richard Bailey was basically the pretty face in the game. He was the golden-tongued salesman who pitched these nags. The people behind him were the real players, and they were the dangerous people. Just so happens one of those said people behind the scenes was none other than Mr. Silas Jane. So in 1992, investigators got another tip from another local law enforcement agency about someone who was involved in a horse scheme. This guy was out in Sacramento, California, but he had ties to Chicago. His name was Joe Plemons. Now, this was a break in the case because investigators in Chicago had actually been trying to track him down. His name had come up in their conversations with other people. Just so happened that he was in custody in Florida, so they fly back down to Florida to talk to him. Mr. Plemons tells his story and claimed that in early 1977, he had lunch with Richard Bailey and another friend named Kenneth Hansen. Kenneth would be later convicted later of murdering 3 boys, but we ain't getting into that one today. We'd be here for another couple of parts.
Are you trying to tell me there's going to be another part 3? There's going to be part 3 of this
Hell
shit?
no, there's not, because I'm not chasing any more rabbits. I'm so damn confused by doing my notes. You can hear me bumbling and stumbling. Hell.
I know, right?
And I cut out about 90% of the bullshit.
Wow.
Yeah. This thing's crazy. So, after this lunch, Richard said something about the candy lady not being so sweet anymore and that he was looking for someone to take care of the situation. He offered $5,000 to whoever would kill her. Kenneth, according to Joe Plemons, said he wouldn't kill an old lady. Richard turns to Joe and asks him. Joe tells him, hell no, buddy, I ain't killing no old woman. And I'm not killing anybody. While this didn't get the investigators to the person hired to kill Helen, it did give them what they believed was a credible story about Richard looking for a hitman shortly before Helen went missing. The list of people ready to flip on Richard for the swindling and the fraud was growing exponentially. Mr. Miller was able to get a grand jury to indict Richard Bailey. In 1994, Richard Bailey was indicted on 29 counts that included all the fraud-related crimes as well as conspiring, soliciting, and causing the murder of Helen Brach. Several other people were also indicted, but only in the financial side of the crimes. Richard Bailey was the only one charged with the murder. Richard made a calculated choice in the spring of 1995. He opted to admit to swindling some of the women, and he pleaded guilty to some of the racketeering, some of the wire fraud, some of the money laundering charges.
I maybe did a little.
I may have dabbled here and there.
I dabbled in a little bit of fraud.
He did not plead guilty to all of them, just 16 of the 29 counts. And he would not plead guilty to anything related to Helen Brach, not conning her and not killing her. They did not take Richard Bailey to trial on the counts he pled not guilty to. Instead, because he pled guilty on some of the charges, the whole case was moved to the sentencing phase. So the judge would decide, based on a preponderance of the evidence, if Richard was guilty of the rest of the charges that included the murder charge, and then the judge would sentence him accordingly. It is theorized that Richard calculated his age into this equation because at the time this was all going down, he was 65 years old. He's probably thinking that he's going to get a lighter sentence because he pled guilty to some of them, took responsibility for more than half the charges, and an experienced judge might find the circumstantial evidence for the murder a lot less convincing than a jury of Richard's peers. He didn't make a very good sympathetic defendant. He was just not a very good person, and there had to have been a fear that the jury's emotional response to him swindling elderly ladies out of their life savings would sway their verdict on the murder charge. So his attorney said they had nothing to gain by going to trial, and that this, going before the judge in the sentencing phase, was the best shot at Richard living to see the end of his prison sentence. So at the sentencing hearing, which lasted 2 weeks, victims of Richard's schemes testified about how he would vanish once the money ran out, leaving some of them penniless. Some people testified about how Richard had been physically violent and made threats against them and their families. As to why the other victims were not killed when they were threatening to go to the authorities or did go to the authorities or did file a civil suit, the prosecution said they were not the threat to him that Helen Brach was. While these victims did have some money, they didn't have Candy heiress fortune money. They also didn't have the connections or the societal standing to really push a case, but Helen did. According to the prosecution, Helen intended to send Richard Bailey to prison for a long time. Now, the defense countered the claims that Richard didn't even sell Helen the horses. His brother did, and the horses were not worthless. Helen had won purses in some of the races because her horse or horses would at least place or show when they didn't win outright. Now, according to the defense, there was no evidence Helen was looking to press charges against Richard. Just 6 weeks before her disappearance, she brought Richard to New York City.
I hear they make good salsa.
That's what I've heard. So she takes him to New York City with her so they could celebrate New Year's Eve together. So I guess they're rocking it with Dick Clark in 77. Now, keep in mind, this is a bench trial sentencing phase where the burden of proof was not beyond a reasonable doubt. It's just a preponderance of the evidence. You may be asking yourself, what the hell is he talking about? Well, in layman's terms, the judge had to decide, was it more likely than not that Richard Bailey had something to do with the planning and or the carrying out of Helen Brach's murder? Well, the answer, according to the judge, was yeah. There was a preponderance of the evidence, and he handed down a life sentence. He soon realized that sentence that he just handed down was outside of the guidelines of the case, so he had to change it. And he changed it to a 30-year sentence. This translated to around 25 years with good behavior. So Richard would have to live to be 90 years old to ever be released from prison unless he was successful on appeal. Now, his appellate attorney was the one and only Kathleen Zellner. And you may be thinking, who in the hell is Kathleen Zellner?
It sounds familiar.
Well, she gained a little bit of notoriety on a Netflix special about one Stephen Avery.
Oh, yeah, that's where I heard that name before.
Yeah. She has also represented Mr. Joe Plemons that we discussed earlier. Now, remember, Joe was the guy who said Richard offered him $5,000 to kill Helen. Joe testifies to this at Richard's sentencing hearing. Fast forward 10 years later, in 2005, Kathleen Zellner filed an appeal because Joe Plemons recants the whole story. His new story was that there was around 10 people who conspired to kill Helen. The people given the orders were Silas Jane and one of the nephews. Probably not the one whose daddy was offed. Joe implicated a number of the people in the crime by name, including a police officer. None of the ones named in his new story were named Richard Bailey, however. He did name Kenneth Hansen, the child killer, and Kenneth's brother, Kurt. Joe would go on to say that there was also a woman involved in the plot. This was not anyone he knew by name. She was actually the person who used Helen's plane ticket from Rochester, Minnesota back to Chicago. Helen had actually been driven back to Chicago from the Mayo Clinic. Joe stated that he got a call from Kenneth Hansen in February of 1977 asking to meet at a stable at 1 a.m. Kenneth stated that he needed help with something. Joe assumed that since it was after midnight, this something had to be of the criminal aspect. He was thinking something like, stolen horses, stolen tractors, farm equipment, all that stuff. But when he arrived, he was told to wait on Brother Kurt. Brother Kurt shows up driving a caddy and gets out, pops the trunk, and inside the trunk, according to Mr. Plemons, is Helen Brach's body. She had been beaten and wrapped in a blanket. He was told that they had to move the body to a station wagon, so he helped by grabbing her feet. Kenneth Hansen thought he heard Helen moan, even though Joe didn't hear shit. They dropped her on the ground, and Kurt gave Joe a gun. Told him to shoot Helen. Joe was like, I don't think so, man. Kurt's like, okay, points a shotgun to him and says, either do it, or there are going to be 2 bodies we have to put in the damn station wagon. Joe, telling himself that Helen was already dead, and since he was in fear for his own life, shot into the blanket twice. So these 3 stooges then put the body in the station wagon and drive it to a steel mill in Gary, Indiana. Now, Gary is about a 30 to 40 minute drive from Chicago at that time of morning/night, however you want to look at it. So with the help of 2 men working at said mill, the body was incinerated. Joe said he came forward with this new story nearly 30 years later because his health was declining and, quote, he couldn't go to the grave with this on his conscience, end quote. So Joe Clemens, who testified that Richard Bailey wanted Helen dead and was looking for someone to do it, was now telling tale that he knew exactly what happened to Helen. Not only did he know who was involved, he knew for a fact that it wasn't Richard Bailey. Joe's story did have a shred of credibility behind it. Joe said to prove all of what he was laying down was true was he had in his possession a ruby ring. Not only a ruby ring, but a ruby ring he claims slid off of Helen's finger when they moved her body to the station wagon. A ring he kept and was now turning over to the police. There was no way to prove it was Helen's. It is assumed and theorized that it never showed up on a list of Helen's belongings. She was never photographed with said ring, and it was never confirmed hers by any of her friends when shown a picture of said ring. DNA tests were performed on the ring, but they didn't come back with anything pointing to Helen because this thing had been handled by God knows who for 30-something years. So as for the people Joe Clemens named, they apparently all denied involvement. Joe's new story was the basis of Richard Bailey's appeal. With Joe changing his story so drastically, Richard's defense wanted a new sentencing hearing. But the appellate court said this, quote, new evidence did not clearly prove Richard was innocent of conspiring in the murder and denied his request. Richard, being the old salty horse swindler that he is, went ahead and lived to be 90 years old and was released on July 25th of 2019.
Could you imagine? Where did he go? What did he do?
After he got out?
Yeah.
He went to Florida.
I'm just saying, you're 90 years old?
He lived for another 3 years and passed away on August the 3rd of 2023.
Oh, my God.
And if you, I don't know, my internet was acting a fool, but there's like ABC 7. I think it's a syndicated ABC channel. There's one in California. There's one in Chicago. They have an interview with him where he basically still claims his innocence and that he actually loved her and would never have harmed her. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the convoluted story of the disappearance of Helen Brach. I don't really have a theory, to be honest with you. The incineration of her body makes sense since nothing has ever been found of hers, like clothing, teeth, bones, none of that. But who knows? I mean, really, there's no way this will ever be solved because with Richard passing away in 2023, just about everybody else connected to the case is now dead and gone. So this will remain a mystery for the ages.
I mean, I don't really have I think she was definitely murdered, but I couldn't tell you by who. There was so many people involved that could want her dead or profit from her death or just, I don't know.
I don't either, man. I don't know if the houseman Jack was smart enough to pull it off on his own. I do kind of lean to him probably being strong-armed into helping tell the tale, but he didn't get shit for it.
Right.
Richard's the only one ever tied to the case to serve prison sentence, and if you type in her name, Helen Brach disappearance, it says the only man ever convicted of her murder Well, technically, he wasn't convicted of her murder. I think he was convicted on conspiring to make her disappear or something like that.
Right. Well, I mean, you're talking about the butler, he didn't profit from anything, but he was definitely given false information and et cetera, et cetera. Maybe he just hated her. That's a possibility.
It is. And I mean, she could have, I don't know why, I can't remember what her age was at the time. She may have started getting old and senile and just mean.
I don't know. That's a good question. You should have researched what age she was when she disappeared.
Well, I'm sure it's in part 1. If I wanted to scroll up and I wasn't so damn lazy, I could probably look at it. When she started dating him, when she started dating Richard, I think she was 62 and 73. So when she disappeared, she was 66. I don't know, but she was active. So I don't know. I don't think, unless she had dementia, but we didn't have that shit back then.
Not a lot of it. People just died.
But anyway, that is, like I said, the story of Helen Brach, and we'll never know. I mean, everybody connected to this case is dead. So that one is a doozy. We've not really set out to do a bunch of part tours. We just get into these cases, and it's a shitload of information. And
we started doing this shit on weekdays, and man, we got to work.
Well, that night, it's hard for me to slide 3 feet to the right to start doing research after I've sat in front of a computer all day trying to stomp out ignorance.
No doubt.
But anyway, all right. Probably going to do something lighthearted next. So if you're not into that, oh well. Recommendations. Now, this is a guilty pleasure. It's actually, you could binge it probably in a weekend. There was a show on Fox called Sleepy Hollow, and it was a variation, kind of a modern day on the Ichabod Crane Sleepy Hollow tale. They're trying to keep the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from returning. It's pretty cool. I'm just through the first season. It's on the Hulu. So if you got the Hulu, all 4 seasons are on there. It's pretty good. Pretty good. Now, back to my recommendation last week with the Zodiac thing. It's not bad. Well, I don't think that was my recommendation. No, Lost Monster Files was my recommendation. On the Secret Sauce Facebook chat group, someone said something about it, and then I said that it was real convenient. All the shit they put forth is really, really convenient. And Coach threw some hate my way. I didn't say it was a bad show. I just said it was real convenient.
Right.
Now, I did reach out to the one and only, the greatest of all times, Mr. Buchholz, and she thought it was just as convenient as I thought. So if you haven't watched it, if you start watching, it's 3 episodes. If you start watching it, you're going to have all these questions. I will tell you, without giving anything away, the last 20 minutes of episode 3 answers all the questions you've got. But it leaves you with a glaring question as to how the hell are they remembering this shit? Just a little too convenient. Just a little too convenient. And not to toot our own horn, but when we interviewed the man who I believe solved it, they don't even touch on the anagrams. They do interview Graysmith. I don't know. I think he had blinders on and really locked into Richard Lee Allen. So, but anyway, you got a recommendation?
I haven't got a chance to watch it yet. It's on my list though, but my list grows exponentially. Speaking of which, another thing that's on my list, my recommendation, I've had several people tell me how good it is, but I haven't watched it. I'm probably going to start it tonight. On Peacock is Anatomy of Lies.
I've heard of that.
Apparently it's about a Grey's Anatomy writer who just went batshit crazy and just
yeah. I saw the previews for that.
More and more extreme lies in her life, and it just spiraled out of control. I've heard it's wild.
Like the Saturday Night Live thing with, what's his name? You know. Yeah. I was a horse trainer.
Yeah, that's the ticket.
Well, Coach, you got anything else?
Brother, you know I don't.
Deuces.